With this weekend, we begin reading the 6th chapter of John, and we'll be reading that for the next 4 or 5 weeks. I think it'll be 5 weeks, I think, before it's finished, but we take a week off to celebrate the Assumption. And I have just a short thing today, two thoughts. First is just to encourage you to read this chapter. It's short. It's, 70-some verses. And you've got 5 weeks to do it, so that's a pretty easy assignment. Read this chapter and read it slowly. John can, don't try to read it all the way through one sitting. John can seem like he's repeating himself. He's not really. If you take the time and read it slowly, he does something like, I forget what it's called in education today, but they learn something in first grade, and then in third or fourth grade they circle back around to it, but learn it again in a little deeper way, and then circle around again in 7th or 8th grade or something, And that's what John does. As he records Jesus' words, his discourses, you'll see in this. If you take the time to read it slowly, you'll see what he's doing. So that's my first thing, is just encourage you. Read this, read it more than once over the next 4 or 5 weeks. If you have a commentary, that's good too, Secondly, I'm not really going to talk about the Eucharist yet. We'll have time in the next weeks to talk about it. Because the Gospel doesn't really talk about the Eucharist yet, The readings don't. What I'd like to do is just give you this little bit of introduction. And the introduction is this, that we see and we start with what I call human insufficiency. Recall what we prayed in the collect, that God, without whom nothing has firm foundation, nothing is holy. And in the preface, I'm going to use the preface for Reconciliation 1 this morning. It talks about when we were lost and could not come to you. Something fundamental happened to human nature when Adam and Eve sinned. It broke our relationship with God. And we could not have union with God because of that. And so we needed, first of all, to be redeemed, and that's what Jesus did. Then we need to have original sin wiped away, and that's what happens in baptism. And then we need grace to come to grow in holiness and to come to union with God. And that's the sacraments. And we take the sacraments for granted a little bit because we're so used to them. But here's one answer to the question, why the sacraments? Because we need them. On our own, we cannot come to holiness. We cannot come to union with God. We cannot come to heaven. And without going into all the sacraments, but basically the sacraments give us the grace we need to do whatever it is. So you don't need the grace of holy orders, but I do. I need those graces. I don't need the graces of matrimony, but many of you do. And notice, well, we all need baptism, right? That's why everyone's baptized. That's how you come into the church and start living your life with God, with Jesus. But notice the sacraments, most of the sacraments we need once, right? So we only need to be baptized once. And many of you know this. If someone comes into the Catholic Church who's been baptized Presbyterian, say, we don't re-baptize. Right? Baptism, a legitimate or a valid baptism, only needs to happen one time. Matrimony, one time. Orders, one time. Sacrament of reconciliation, we don't need every day, hopefully, but Some need it more often than others, but we need it periodically, right? But the Eucharist is available to us every day, and that should tell us something. And so I just want to leave you with that thought and to think about that. That on our own, we cannot approach God. We cannot have union with God. We need grace. And I'm afraid that most of us, and I too, you can fall into it. Because I don't know what it feels like to not be redeemed, right? So if we could feel that somehow, we would pay more attention to it maybe. I don't know what it feels like to have original sin on my soul, you know. I don't know what that feels like. So I'm not sure I take it as seriously maybe as I could, you know. But you know, sometimes when you're weighed down by guilt, you know what it feels like to receive God's forgiveness in the sacrament of reconciliation. And so that's a little more tangible for us, you know. But we are completely dependent on God, on God's grace. Yes, our salvation depends on us to some degree. We have to do some things. But even our best and hardest efforts would not bring us into union with God if it weren't for God's grace. And so we begin these next few weeks of meditating on John's chapter 6. And we begin with this. And recall it as we go along these weeks. This idea that human insufficiency, you know, the man from Baal, Shalisha, comes to Elisha and says, I have 20 barley loaves. And he says, go feed those 100 people. You can't. But with God, whatever God did there, it was sufficient and overflowing. He had some left over. Philip says to Jesus, even 200 days' wages would not be enough to feed all these people, even a little bit. And they come and Andrew says, well, we have 5 loaves and these 2 fish, you know, for these thousands of people. On a human basis, it's not enough. But when God is at work, and God's grace is at work, it's not only enough, it's more than enough. You know? And so that's where we begin with these weeks of meditating on the insufficiency of human efforts alone and the overabundance of grace. And hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll see what that means and how that plays out.